living La Vida Low-Carb. This show is changing lives. We talking about your diet, trying to get you feeling right. Cut up them avocados, fry some eggs, time to explore the longest running health podcast, hosted by Jimmy Moore. Time to give up the crappy garbage, we're getting into ketosis. Every day is a new step to your goal, yeah, you're getting closer. Motivated and focused, don't stop, just go. Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low-Carb Show. Hey, the LivingLowCarbShow.com.
Guys, I wanted to tell you about a brand new study. This study literally just came out. And this is a part of my series, Jimmy Makes Science Simple. I like to take studies and make them simple. And so this one here today, it was published in the July 2021 issue of the journal Current Opinion Endocrinology. And the title of the paper, Renal Function, which is kidneys, in patients following a low carbohydrate diet for type 2 diabetes. And so it's a review of the literature and an analysis of routine clinical data from a primary care service over 7 years. And so I was looking at the researchers. I know two of them, David Unwin and Jen Unwin. They're the primary authors on the paper, but there's several others on here as well. And they've been doing great work out of the UK, looking at low-carb diets, looking at all the various benefits that come from eating low-carb. And so they focused in on this study on kidney function as well as some cardiovascular markers. So let's take a look at the study. So the purpose of this review, people with type 2 diabetes who follow a low-carb diet may increase their dietary protein intake. Dietary protein can modulate renal function, so there is some debate about the role in renal disease. There is a concern that higher protein intakes may promote renal damage and that low-carb diets themselves may impact cardiovascular risk as well. So we're going to review the evidence around low-carb diets, renal function, cardiovascular risk factors, as well as compare them to results in a real-world primary care setting. Since I came around 17 years ago, one of the first complaints besides cardiovascular health that they had about the Atkins diet was that it messes with your kidneys. And they always pointed to the excessive protein in the Atkins diet. And so they've long made that claim. Now, I've never seen a study that shows that you get renal damage as a result of eating protein in your diet, but they still make the claim. So they wanted to see if that claim was true. So the recent findings, chronic kidney disease is a well-recognized microvascular complication as a result of type 2 diabetes, caused in part by chronically increased glomerular pressure, hyperfiltration, increased blood pressure, and advanced glycation end products, the AGEs. Hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar, can be seen as essential in all of these factors. So a low-carb diet is an effective first step in correcting this in the real world. So that's how that comes about. So the summary of what they found, and then we'll get into the study here in just a moment. They found that low-carb diets for people with type 2 diabetes may improve renal function as well as cardiovascular risk factors. And then Dr. Unwin, he said, in our own cohort of 143 patients in his clinic over the past 7 years with normal renal function and only mild CKD, over an average of 30 months, the serum creatinine improved by a significant mean of 4.7. That's pretty amazing. What remains to be shown is the effect of the approach on people with type 2 diabetes and moderate to severe CKD. So that's what they wanted to look at in this one, was just general people with type 2 diabetes doing a low-carb diet. They didn't really look at really bad cases. All right, so let's take a look at the introduction. And if you just joined us, I am reading from a review. We're doing a Jimmy Makes Science Simple here today. It's currently out of the journal that just got published, July 2021. Last week it came out. Current Opinion Endocrinology is the name of the journal. Renal function in patients following a low carbohydrate diet for type 2 diabetes, name of the paper. Introduction. Recent dietary trends for those with type 2 diabetes include keto and low carbohydrate diets, which may lead to a potentially increase in their protein intake. Not may, it does. Like people that start eating keto, maybe they've never prioritized animal-based proteins before, and suddenly it makes you kind of prioritize it. As a result, the safety of habitually consuming dietary protein in excess of recommended intakes has been questioned. In particular, there is concern that high protein intake may promote renal damage, again, that's kidneys, by chronically increasing glomerular pressure and hyperfiltration. So what this paper does is it reviews some of the available evidence and it looks at relevant real-world data from their primary care clinic there in the UK. First hinted at by Wilhelm Greisinger in 1859, chronic kidney disease, that's what CKD is now a recognized microvascular complication of diabetes. And in this context, it is called diabetic kidney disease or diabetic nephropathy, not neuropathy, nephropathy. Diagnosis requires an estimated glomerular filtration rate of around 60 milliliters per minute, and the microalbuminuria of less than 3 milligrams per gram, with a ratio between those two of less than 3. So that's what they're looking for. So that's people in either type 1 or type 2 diabetes category. So the development of this is associated with longer duration of diabetes. It's often preceded by diabetic retinopathy. Metabolic changes associated with diabetes drive this hypertrophy, tubulointerstitial inflammation, glomerulosclerosis, and underlie the progression of the disease. Concomitant essential hypertension, that's the high blood pressure, is also likely to contribute to the pathophysiology. So basically they're outlining this is why this is so important to bring under control, because when people have damage to their kidneys as a result of being type 2 diabetic, this is how it starts to all break down. Signs of progression of this disease include worsening albuminuria, decreasing EGFR, increasing serum, that's blood, creatinine, and hypertension. So a low-carb diet can be an effective option in the management of many of these metabolic conditions, including type 2 diabetes. It was recently endorsed, I believe it was 3.5 years ago, by the American Diabetes Association. I really wish they would put that out there a little bit more to let people know that type 2 diabetics should be at least considering a low-carb diet, because we know there's great efficacy for controlling that disease. Despite having no formally accepted definition, low-carb diets are generally considered to contain less than 130 grams of carbohydrate per day. You do that by reducing simple sugars, starchy carbohydrates such as rice, potatoes, bread, pasta, and other grain-based products. So they said less than 130 grams of carbohydrate a day is a low-carb diet. I would disagree with that. I think if we're just going to talk about low-carb diets, I think under 100 grams is probably considered a low-carb diet. If you're talking about a ketogenic diet, it definitely needs to be under 50 grams. There was a study that came out, it was a bunch of the different low-carb ketogenic researchers out there, and they defined all of these terms, and they found lower carb was like 100 to 150 grams. Low carb was like 50 to 100 grams. Ketogenic was under 50 grams. Now, some people need to be significantly below that 50 grams in order to be in nutritional ketosis. 50 grams could be too much. And of course, all of those are total. We're not playing the net carb nonsense game. It's stupid to do that. Don't count net carbs. It's total carbs. And if you can have more carbs, more power to you. But don't play that game. That game don't work because that game ain't valid. In their 2018 policy statement, the British Dietetic Association concluded that low-carb diets can be effective for managing weight, improving your blood sugar, the glycemic control, and cardiovascular risk in people with type 2 diabetes. But they did raise concerns about long-term adherence, meaning over 12 months, and the potential negative effects on heart health. Well, they have made this claim for many years as well. And I know Virta Health is currently in, I think, year 4 or 5 of their study, where they've been looking at patients with type 2 diabetes and following them and putting them on ketogenic diet, and they haven't had any such problems with their cardiovascular health. This has been my problem since day one of being a blogger and then a podcaster, is they make all these claims about low-carb diets, and most of those claims have never come to pass. And it's a shame they got away with it for so long that people actually believed it. Oh my gosh, if I eat more fat, I'm going to clog my arteries. Oh my gosh, I need to get my total cholesterol down, so I've got to drink vegetable oil and I've got to take a statin drug. They scared people into doing things that they didn't have any trouble with at all. And yet, it still persists. You ask most people what leads to heart disease, and they're probably going to tell you saturated fat, because that's what they've been told. People following a low-carb diet may well replace dietary carbohydrate with relative increases in dietary fat and protein. Increasing dietary fat has historically been attributed to cardiovascular disease, meaning they've said that it does. Attributed to and have evidence of are two very different things. They have never had any evidence that increasing dietary fat leads to any increase in your cardiovascular risk markers. Increasing dietary protein may aid in satiety as well as weight loss, but protein can modulate renal function, and some studies suggest intakes in excess of recommended daily allowances may increase the risk of developing this kidney disease. So I've never understood that one either. We call protein essential amino acids, okay? Just like we call fat essential fatty acids. Ironically enough, there's no such thing as essential carbohydrate acids. It just doesn't exist because you don't have a dietary need for carbohydrate, but you do the fats, you do the proteins. And so this fear-mongering over, oh my gosh, don't eat too much fat. Oh my gosh, don't eat too much protein. What does that do? It pushes people to the only macronutrient that's left, and that's carbohydrate. And what a metabolic disaster that has been. And by the way, when they pushed us towards that started in 1980. You look at any health charts starting in 1980, obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, on down the list. What happened to all of the rates of all of those things when they told people eat less fat, don't eat the protein, you're going to harm your kidneys, and eat more carbohydrate? What happened? We saw a radical jump in the rates of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, on and on and on. Brenner, Meyer, and Hostetler's 1982 highly cited review on this topic concluded that regular overconsumption of protein negatively impacts kidney function via a sustained increase in glomerular pressure as well as renal hyperfiltration. Most of the evidence from this review was from animal studies, so they didn't look at humans. When you hear about studies, guys, always figure out, okay, is the study of human beings? If not, it's not applicable to you. Is the study in a clinical setting where they've got them locked up in a metabolic ward and they're doing a randomized controlled trial? That is a great study. But that's not what they did in this 1982 study that they're citing here. That study did not answer whether the primary driver was relatively high protein in the diet per se, or unrelenting ad libitum nature of modern eating patterns. Two recent large-scale cohort studies based on food frequency questionnaires reported that there was an association between high protein intake as well as a decline in renal function. Association does not mean causation. Keep that in mind as well. This is where sometimes we get into trouble, where we say there's associations, and so people automatically jump, well, it's associated, so when this happened, and we think this caused this, and that's not always true.
Real Good Foods is one of the fastest growing frozen food companies in the U.S. Everything they make is nutrient dense, high in protein, low in carbs, and made from real food ingredients. They make food for every occasion: breakfast sandwiches, poppers, enchiladas, entrees, and pizza. So whether you're on a keto diet, trying to cut back on your carbs, or just trying to eat healthier, they make super convenient and tasty options. RealGoodFoods.com and @RealGoodFoods on social media.
On the other hand, evidence from several randomized controlled trials, so there's those really good studies I was talking about, up to 2 years in length, suggest that higher protein, lower carbohydrate diets do not worsen renal function in people with normal renal function at baseline. In other words, they didn't have anything wrong with their kidneys at the beginning of the study, and it did not get worse even with those who had type 2 diabetes. And yet, there remains a paucity of scientific literature about the impact on renal function of advising low-carb diets to people with type 2 diabetes, with and without the kidney disease, particularly in the real-world setting. So against this background, the Norwood Surgery, a National Health Service that's over in the UK, general practice in the northern of England, has been offering a low-carb diet approach to its patients with type 2 diabetes since 2013. This is Dr. Unwin's clinic, the lead study author, Dr. David Unwin. Given the concerns and uncertainties surrounding the risks of low-carb diet on kidney disease as well as cardiovascular disease, also the lack of any longer-term real-world primary care data on using this approach, this paper serves as a review of the evidence, and it presents clinical data from the latest service evaluation. We aim to address the following question. For patients who choose a low-carb diet to help manage their type 2 diabetes, how might their renal risk factors such as serum creatinine, eGFR, urinary albumin creatinine ratio, body weight, glycemic control, remember blood sugar, as represented by their A1C, blood pressure, and lipid profiles be affected over time? So that's what they want to look at, and that's what we're going to examine here in this paper. So the methods they use, we present a retrospective analysis of routine clinical data from a single suburban GP practice with approximately 9,700 patients in northern England. Advice on following a low-carb diet was offered routinely by specifically trained GPs and practice nurses to the 485 patients in the practice who were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. The doctor-practice nurse protocol for this approach is shown in the supplemental file, which we'll get to here in a second. Data was collected for 7 years. So they collected from March of 2013 until March of last year. After an introduction to LCDs and how they may improve glycemic control, low-carb diets is LCD, patients were asked if they were interested in pursuing this treatment option under medical supervision, having regular blood tests and weight measurements about 3 times a year. Low-carb diets were introduced as an option alongside clear and simplified explanations of key physiological principles. They taught them how glucose and insulin levels change in response to different foods, the composition of starchy carbohydrates as many glucose molecules, and the concept that foods can have either a low or a high glycemic index, GI, or glycemic load, the GL. So those of you not familiar with glycemic load, most people have heard of glycemic index, and that's basically the equivalent of sugar from that food. Glycemic load takes into account the portion size, and so how much of that food does it take to give you that glycemic amount in that food. The low-carb diet sheet that we offered to people with type 2 diabetes is based on glycemic index and glycemic load data derived from the index. It is designed with the aim of encouraging a reduction in the intake of all sugary and starchy foods by replacing them, for example, with green leafy vegetables, full-fat dairy, eggs, meat, fish, berries, and nuts. So they do have that chart there. This is what they hand to the patients. A little small, a little hard to read, but just know it's all the stuff that you probably know if you follow Jimmy Moore. And it's just basically explaining what the diet is in pretty pithy language. So just a little highlights. They do say you may need more salt on your low-carb diet. You should focus on meat, eggs. 3 eggs is not too much. I love how they're giving them little tips like that. Look for the more fatty fishes. Plain full-fat yogurt is a good breakfast with some berries. You can have processed meats like bacon, ham, sausage, salami. They're not as healthy, but you can still have them. Fats are fine. Olive oil, butter. Don't ever use margarine. Could be better for you if you got butter. Coconut oil. Avoid margarine, corn oil, vegetable oils. Beware any foods that have the phrase low fat on them. All the things that you already know. All right. This work is subject to ongoing audit of service provision. Practice patients who have type 2 diabetes and choose the low-carb diet are coded as such within the practice electronic health record. The relevant records can then be easily retrieved and interrogated to produce the data which is presented at baseline, and then the latest follow-up. The metrics measured are part of the routine care for this clinic. Exclusion criteria were severe mental illness, so if somebody was mentally ill, they left them out. Terminal illness, meaning they were already dying. You don't want to really use them in your data. And then those who had eating disorders, until they got that under control, they did not need to be participating in a study. Baseline measurements of weight and blood pressure were done at the surgery and the blood test by local phlebotomists. By the end of March 2020, after 7 years, there were 143 patients who had persisted for 7 years on this study. For whom they stayed on the diet the entire time, and they had data. A note on the ethical considerations of this work is found in the supplemental. All right, so statistical analysis of the cohort results. They performed various analyses on it. That's a little nerdy. I don't think you need to know that. Just know they used all kinds of analyses to come up with the various numbers in this. So, what were the cohort results? Of those 143 patients with type 2 diabetes, 91 of them, 64%, were male. The average age was 61. This represents 29% of the known type 2 diabetes population in this clinic. They were recorded as on a low-carb diet for a significant period of 30 months. At baseline, they had type 2 diabetes for a mean duration of 5 years and 3 months. So they'd had type 2 diabetes for a little while when they started the study. Table 1 shows descriptive statistics for renal and cardiovascular variables at baseline and at follow-up for all of the participants. There was a statistically significant reduction in all variables of interest other than a statistically significant increase in EGFR and HDL cholesterol. Now, HDL going up on a low-carb diet is not surprising because two of the hallmarks that happen when you go on a low-carb diet should happen to everybody that eats a low-carb ketogenic diet. Your triglycerides will fall like a rock under 100, and your HDL will generally go well above 50. And that's just something that just axiomatically happens. Some people also see a bump in their LDL, their LDLC, which if you do a breakdown, it's generally of the healthier version of LDL, the pattern A, and less of the unhealthy version. All right, so let's take a look at some of this data. I've got the chart here to look at some of the data. And it looks like, I'm trying to see if anything jumps off the page. Yeah, total cholesterol did fall. Not hugely so, but enough to kind of go, okay. HDL did go up. Triglycerides. Triglycerides, now keep in mind, this is in millimole per liter, not in what we use here in America. Triglycerides were 2.1 at the beginning, and at the end, they were 1.3. So they dropped pretty darn significantly. Blood pressure dropped from 140/80 to 132/78. Not hugely dropped, but enough of a drop to kind of say, okay, that's cool. Yeah. But the creatinine dropped from 80 to 74.5. Yeah. I'm trying to see if there's anything else on here of interest. I don't see anything. All right, so let's get to the renal function of this study. There were significant improvements in all three measures of renal function: serum creatinine, eGFR, and urine ACR. The most statistically significant improvement and with the most complete data set was the serum creatinine. This reduced by a mean of 4.7. Out of 132 patients, 88 of them, which was 67%, showed an improvement in the creatinine as shown in figure 2. So there's figure 2. You can see all the data that they had. And yeah, you could see that 67% improved their creatinine, 29% had worse creatinine, and then 4% saw no change. But the average was a reduction, an improvement by 4.71, which is pretty cool. In figure 3, we present regression analyses plotting improvements in creatinine as the outcome against changes in 4 other metrics. So they looked at weight, HbA1c, systolic BP, and diastolic BP, so the blood pressure. The low values for R squared and large p values indicate very little relationship between improvements in creatinine and improvements in these measures. So a little hard to see, but there is that data showing the analysis. And again, if you've ever read a study, you're going to see these little dots kind of all over the page. A little bit hard to read, but that's all the data points of the various people in the study. And then that line in the middle tends to be the average from all of those data points. What about weight and blood sugar control? Weight dropped significantly from a median of 97.3. Keep in mind that's kilos. So they started at 215 pounds on average, and then they dropped to 88 kilograms, 194. So they went from 215 to 194. The average participant lost nearly 10% of their body weight. That's really good. Of the 143 participants, 3 weight measurements were missing, and 134 of them, which was 94% of them, lost weight. This improvement in the glycemic control over time was observed in all patients despite a net deprescribing of 35 medications. So keep in mind, they were medicated trying to control their A1C during this particular intervention with the low-carb diet. They came off of those medications because they wanted to see the power of the diet itself, and they still saw improvements in their A1C. That should get the spidey senses up of anyone paying attention. Here you had heavily medicated type 2 diabetics, and they were able to come off of 35 different medications just with a low-carb diet. Is that encouraging to you? I think it should be very encouraging. Cases of note include 6 patients who were able to come off of insulin. So some of them were taking, remember, type 2 diabetics don't have to take insulin unless their insulin production is just so reduced that they need it. They came off of it altogether. A further 9 who had their insulin dosage reduced significantly using the definition of type 2 diabetes remission. Of the 143 patients who chose a low-carb diet, 68 were off of all their drugs for diabetes, and their A1C came down into well within the healthy range. It equates to a remission rate of 48%. You know, if we had a drug that produced 48% basically curing of diabetes, they would be heralding that as a breakthrough miracle drug. But it's not a drug. It's just a low-carb diet. Can they not see that there's something there? There's a there. Of course there is. Updated remission rates for this cohort between 2017 and 2021 are in the supplemental. They have now seen an increase from 31% to 52% over 4 years, a drug-free remission rate for the practice overall, using the total number of patients with type 2 diabetes and our practice register as a denominator, is now at 20% as of March of 2021. In other words, of all their patients that have come in, 20% of them have reversed and cured their type 2 diabetes. That is amazing. How about lipid profiles? Table 1 shows a statistically significant reduction in the total cholesterol as well as triglycerides, not surprising. We also saw a significant increase in HDL cholesterol and a corresponding significant decrease in the calculated LDL. This is despite a net total of 5 patients who were on a statin drug that came off of the statin during the study. Are you guys getting this in this study? They started the study with heavily medicated type 2 diabetic patients with major insulin resistance. They put them on a low-carb diet, and they're coming off of drugs, and they're improving all these cardiovascular risk markers, these renal risk markers, their blood sugar and their insulin, all getting better on a low-carb diet. If we need proof positive that this way of eating is healthy, I think we're seeing it in this brand new study.
Tired of playing the mask game? Me too. That's why I wanted to tell you about the Unmask. This is a breathable, completely breathable. It covers, you can't even see that it's breathable, but it's breathable. Whether you're going on a plane, having to go into a store and wearing this thing, playthemaskgame.com is how you can get this mask. They come in all kinds of colors and everything. In fact, right there, you can see right through it what it is, but when you're wearing it, it does not look like it's anything different, but it's breathable, baby. Playthemaskgame.com.
Improvements in blood pressure were observed. The mean reduction of the systolic and diastolic blood pressure was 11.7 and 5.7 respectively. This was despite 18 of the patients taken off of their hypertensive medication. So again, came off of medications. They came off of insulin and diabetes medications. They came off of the statin for their cholesterol. They came off of the hypertension medication for their high blood pressure. The moral of this story is go on a low-carb ketogenic diet and you could come off of your medications. And I don't know about you, I haven't had to be on medications for 17 years, but those medications add up monetarily. They take a hit. And never mind that they're not actually dealing with the underlying cause of why you have those issues. They just cover it up. And people are oblivious that if they simply shifted their diet to more of a low-carb approach, they wouldn't have to be on those medications. All right, so in the discussion part of the study, the UK prospective diabetes study showed that over a median of 15 years from type 2 diabetes diagnosis, nearly 40% of patients developed albuminuria and nearly 30% developed renal impairment. Having advised a low-carb diet to a cohort of 143 people with type 2 diabetes, we observed over an average of 30 months, significant improvements in a range of variables relevant to renal and cardiovascular health, creatinine, eGFR, urine ACR, HbA1c, blood pressure, weight. This is remarkable when you consider this cohort was an average age of 61. Usually they say, oh, they're too old to change now. A lot of people tell themselves that. It's too late. I've lived too much life and too much damage has been done. It's too late. And if this study says nothing else, it tells you it's never too late. Never. An average duration of type 2 diabetes at baseline was 5 years and 3 months. So they thought they were going to be diabetic forever. Typically, a general pattern of deterioration in these parameters over such a time would be anticipated. Our results also contradict the literature on renal aging, which is considered by many to be part of the normal aging process of cellular and organ senescence. So that's true. As you get older, you just assume you're going to lose your mental faculties. God, I hope I keep my mental faculties as I get older, because that's something I value. I greatly value the way my brain operates, the way I feel mentally. This phenomenon describes how progressive physiological nephron loss in adults leads to a reduction of eGFR at a rate of 1 milliliter per minute, blah, 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 blah. In the context of type 2 diabetes and kidney disease, anticipating an even greater rate of decline in eGFR would not be considered unreasonable. This makes the mean improvement that they saw during this study all the more remarkable. To our knowledge, this is the first primary care service evaluation data published that suggests that the management of type 2 diabetes with a low-carb diet may improve the biomarkers of kidney disease. You guys getting this? You know anybody in your life dealing with some kidney issues that are also type 2 diabetic? Could it be their diet that's exacerbating it? Could be. In this review, we consider 3 major factors in kidney disease: chronic hyperglycemia, so high blood pressure or blood sugar, body weight, and hypertension, high blood pressure. We also explore the possible role of dietary macronutrients, so the fat, protein, carbohydrate, particularly focusing in on protein and carbohydrates and getting those in the proper amounts on the renal function in those with type 2 diabetes. So they took a look at hyperglycemia in a diabetic kidney disease. So this is the high blood sugar. Many of the underlying mechanisms for kidney disease can be attributed directly to chronic hyperglycemia playing a central part in a cascade of damaging effects. Hyperglycemia, with its osmotic effect, leads to an increased renal filtration, an increased glomerular pressure, which in turn leads to glomerular hyperfiltration, a high local production of angiotensin II at the effervent arteriole produces vasoconstriction, worsening the situation. In other words, it makes it worse, and it's not a good thing. Associated with this are the negative effects of advanced glycation end products, AGEs. If you're not familiar with that before, AGEs, advanced glycation end products, nasty, and think of their ages because they age you. It's the way to remember them. The result of irreversible glycation of proteins occurring in the presence of intracellular hyperglycemia. In other words, the proteins in your blood mixed with this higher blood sugar, ostensibly from the carbohydrates you're eating in your diet, actually causes this AGE production to get ramped way up. AGEs impair the function of both the intracellular and the extracellular proteins. And guess what it does? It leads to inflammation and cell damage. So if we're trying to lower inflammation and we're trying to protect our cell health, you don't want AGEs in the body. The average weight of our cohort was the 97.3 kilos, 215 pounds. So many of them were overweight. Hyperglycemia in the setting of obesity may also impair this process of autophagy. So you usually hear about that in terms of fasting. It's all these dead proteins in the body. Well, guess what? Those proteins in the presence of higher blood sugar, if you don't get rid of them, they will glycate. They will develop these advanced glycation end products, and you will get this cell breakdown, and you will get increases in inflammation. It's inevitable. It includes and involves intracellular degradation of the cytotoxic proteins and organelles by lysosomes wherever a cell is experiencing oxidative stress. Impaired autophagy leads to renal tubular cell damage. Yet another reason why you should try to focus in on getting some periods of fasting to induce this autophagy. Get rid of those proteins so that they cannot become impaired and lead to oxidative stress, which would then lead to kidney issues. You don't want to damage your kidneys. And it's not so much the protein you're eating in your diet like they've claimed. It's the proteins that just kind of are left floating in the body, nowhere to go. All you would need to do is fast for a few days and clean those up and do a reset. But most people don't do that. And then they lead to all these inflammatory problems in the body. One major cohort study investigating primary and secondary prevention of kidney disease demonstrated that simply reducing HbA1c via a combination of anti-diabetic medications as well as lifestyle modifications can have favorable effects on the development of kidney disease. However, intensive glycemic control with certain medications is associated with an increased risk of hypoglycemia, so it could drop the blood sugar too much doing it medically, which is why having nutritional and other lifestyle approaches is always a good idea to have in your back pocket. This is why our low-carb diet service was associated with a mean improvement in A1C, and nearly half of these patients, 48% of them, got to drug-free status as a type 2 diabetic in remission, thus minimizing their risk for this hypoglycemia. As per the various mechanisms described above, we hypothesize that a reduction in chronic hyperglycemia decreases the osmotic diuretic effects, thus reducing glomerular hyperfiltration and many of the other risk factors contributing to kidney disease. By all accounts, eating a low-carb diet improves kidney disease progression so that you're not going to deal with that issue. So the UK prospective diabetes study concluded that mortality rates for those with nephropathy are high, increasing from 1.4 to 4.6 and to 19.2 for those with renal impairment. More intensive blood glucose control resulted in a 33% reduction in relative risk of development of microalbuminuria and clinical grade proteinuria at 12 years, and a significant reduction in the proportion doubling their plasma creatinine. This seems to justify a closer look at the methods for how we can improve hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, in a clinical context to preserve renal function in at-risk groups. Are you getting this, guys? You guys are probably getting it because you follow my work, but tell people dealing with kidney disease, dealing with type 2 diabetes, dealing with high cholesterol and they're worried about the cholesterol and cardiovascular health, tell them it's related to your high blood sugar. Do things to get your blood sugar under control. Check your blood sugar. And now we've got these CGMs, the continuous glucose monitors you can put in your arm. There's no excuse why you're not testing your blood sugar at this point. And see how you do and get it under control sooner than later. Reducing your dietary sugar and refined carbohydrate intake is arguably the logical first step in achieving this lowering of hyperglycemia. The significant improvements in A1C in our cohort, in whom 97% of the people in this study reduced their A1C despite coming off of all of their diabetes medications, appears to support this approach. How about body weight and hypertension? The significant mean weight loss of 9.5 kilograms observed in the cohort may have itself improved the eGFR. Remember, that was 10% of their starting weight. However, the relationship between weight loss and improved renal function is not consistent or straightforward. In randomized trials, weight loss via diet or bariatric surgery will reduce the urinary ACR, but the effects on estimated glomerular filtration rate are still inconsistent as well. We found no link between weight loss and improved creatinine in our study. Another potential explanation for our results may be via the effect of improving blood pressure. Hypertension is an important factor in the development of kidney disease. In patients with stage 3 to 5 kidney disease, each 10 milligram or mmHg increase in mean systolic BP is associated with a 15% increase in the hazard ratio for developing impaired kidney function. The relationship between dietary carbohydrates and blood pressure has been considered in an earlier report from this cohort. Suffice it to say, there is good evidence that one of the effects of insulin in patients with type 2 diabetes is renal sodium retention and an increase in your blood pressure. If you've got high blood pressure and you're taking a medication for that and you're not eating a low-carb diet, get on a low-carb diet. I remember when I went on the Atkins diet, I was taking a high blood pressure medication. And within 6 weeks of going on the Atkins diet, I was getting dizzy getting up off of couches, and I concluded I didn't need the blood pressure medication anymore because the diet had fixed it, and I never went back on blood pressure medication again. This physiology goes into reverse in a low-carb diet, helping to explain the 17 patients coming off of their medications. Mechanistically, it follows their reversal of renal sodium retention, leads to increased sodium and water excretion, which manifests as a marked diuresis. This may explain why 3 patients were able to come off of their potent diuretic. Our results align with those of several meta-analyses carried out in mostly healthy individuals that found a higher protein diet, defined as 1.5 kilograms of protein per kilogram, or grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, or 20% of their total calories coming from protein, which is about 100 grams of total protein per day, did not significantly impact their eGFR. Only 4 of the 28 included studies had participants with type 2 diabetes. 3 of those were focused on lean and plant-based sources of protein, which you know are a far cry from animal-sourced proteins. A 1-year-long randomized controlled trial that used a diet of similar composition to the one that we advise, but with measured macronutrient intakes, 14% carbs, 28% protein, 58% fat, they concluded that compared with a traditional high-carb diet that's to induce weight loss, consumption of a low-carb, high-protein diet does not adversely affect clinical markers of renal function in obese adults. Another randomized controlled trial found no adverse effect of a low-carb approach on renal health, but greater optimization of type 2 diabetes management over 2 years. It's also important to remember that our real-world type 2 diabetes cohort from primary care had a baseline median eGFR of 85.5, representing quite good renal function. So our results may not be as relevant to those who do have renal disease. So I guess it remains to be seen that if the renal function, the kidney disease was more progressed, would they see as dramatic an improvement? Is there a point where you've gone too far in the disease progression that you can't really reverse it? But they at least have shown that if you're on the edge there of developing it, the higher protein that you consume is not going to push you over the edge into kidney damage, as has been hypothesized for many years. A Cochrane review looking at adults with kidney disease found much of the relevant evidence to be weak. It concluded that diet changes may lower blood pressure and cholesterol, but the longer-term impact of these effects on well-being is not proven. This means we still need more large, good-quality research studies to help understand the impact of diet on the health of people with kidney disease. This is my problem. We don't have the studies that support that eating a higher protein diet is going to do any damage to your kidneys. And yet that's the message that people are hearing. Oh my gosh, you got kidney problem. Oh, kidney disease. Oh no. Or before you even eat protein, oh my gosh, you know you're going to develop kidney disease. There's no evidence of that. And so in the lack of evidence, how do you make a proclamation one way or another? I think how you educate patients is you say, look, we don't know because there's no evidence long-term that shows eating more protein is going to push you into more propensity for having kidney disease or less. We don't know. The studies have not been done. There has been an observational study looking at the effect of a very low-calorie ketogenic diet, less than 50 grams of carbohydrate a day, in people who had mild cases of kidney disease. They reported normalization of eGFR in 27.7% of the participants, despite the dietary intervention having a protein content of around 1 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of their ideal body weight. So, returning to the possible underlying etiology of our improved results for renal function, as already mentioned, it was unexpected that the regression analysis returned no evidence of the weight loss having any impact on that. Improvements in blood pressure and diabetes control, as measured by the HbA1c, correlated significantly with the improvements in the kidney function. Lower your weight, get your A1C under control seems to be the take-home message here in this study. This could point to there being another more important factor at play here. Another possible mechanism by which low-carb diets might mediate an improvement in renal function is nitric oxide, which has an important function in the maintenance of microvascular endothelial function. It has been known for some time that insulin's effect on vascular endothelium is mediated through its own receptor and insulin signaling pathways, resulting in the increased release of nitric oxide, a process that is disrupted in the state of a systemic insulin resistance. So, getting your insulin resistance under control, boosting your nitric oxide, lowering your blood sugar, lowering your blood pressure, all of these are going to do profound things to prevent progression of kidney disease. This was investigated recently by a randomized controlled trial of a 6-week low-carb diet. It improved microvascular endothelial functioning via increased bioavailability of nitric oxide in women with obesity. So whatever the underlying reasons for the significant improvements in renal function that our study revealed, there seems to be a good physiological argument for putting improved blood glucose central to the care of people with type 2 diabetes. Why hasn't it already been central? Isn't type 2 diabetes a disease of having too high of a blood sugar that can't come down because the insulin receptors are malfunctioning, because your insulin is not pumping at the level that it needs to bring it under control, and that insulin has become resistant to dealing with that excess blood glucose? Isn't lowering blood sugar kind of been the goal all along? And if it hasn't been, why not? You take care of people with type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and diabetic kidney disease, diabetic kidney disease. It is likely that reducing hyperglycemia improves type 2 diabetes. It should. In addition to the hypertension and renal function in this vulnerable group, our cohort results suggest that for those interested in safely improving blood glucose to achieve these potential benefits, our method of advising a reduction in dietary sugar and dietary starchy carbohydrate is a sensible approach. After 8 years of experience in providing this very service, we find it to be clinically effective, patient-friendly, and sustainable. I love that they're getting this out there. So, some practical considerations to take under advisement: medication and deprescribing. In our clinic, many patients had their high blood pressure medications as well as their diabetes medications reduced while on a low-carb diet. This has probably contributed to the practice spending over 55,000 pounds per year, less than the local practice average when it comes to drugs for diabetes. That's pretty profound. Careful deprescribing and a vigilance with looking at blood pressure and glucose monitoring are essential to avoid things like hypotension, hypoglycemia, and hyperglycemia. The British Journal of General Practice recently published a relevant open access paper on safe deprescribing if a patient goes on a low-carb diet. A multidisciplinary approach with a team of experts in low-carb diets in particular is important for patients on these medications. So keep this in mind. You got people that want to go keto and low carb and they're type 2 diabetic, and they've got these medications for diabetes, for kidney disease, for high blood pressure, all these things, high cholesterol. Make sure they are under a doctor's care, because the doctor is going to see a very quick and profound drop for the need for those medications. And if you're not being monitored, it can actually lead to problems. And I actually had a lady write me one time, I went on that keto diet and I felt like crap. I just got weak. And so the first question I said was, well, what are you eating? And so she described the food. It was pretty good. And then I said, so are you on any medications for a disease? Oh yeah, I take this for this and this for this and this for this. And I'm like, you need to see your doctor and you need to come off of some of those medications while you're doing this diet. You've got to look at the low-carb ketogenic diet just like you would a medication. And so she's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea, because they didn't educate her on this. And so she came off of the diabetes medication that was lowering her blood sugar. And so she was getting hypoglycemic is what happened. And so she came off of that, went back on the ketogenic diet, and her natural blood sugar just came down with the diet to the point that she didn't need those medications anymore. And she was flabbergasted. But she blamed keto because she started feeling bad. And it wasn't the diet, it was the drugs that she was still taking that she no longer needed to take. All right, so they did look at some of the limitations of their cohort. When analyzing real-world data from lifestyle interventions in clinical practice, there are common problems. First, both randomization and blinding are not possible. They're seeing patients. They're trying to get them better. They just couldn't do that. It's not ethical either. If they know that a low-carb diet is going to help with their diabetes and kidneys and cholesterol and blah, 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 they're not going to put them on anything but a low-carb diet. So that's kind of an ethical problem. There was really no placebo arm to compare anything to. Interventions can be hard to clearly define and verify as to adherence to specific parameters. Even food questionnaires and diaries are always imperfect. More on this is in the supplemental file. In view of these limitations, we suggest that in future research, the investigators should look at the exact dietary pattern and macronutrient composition followed by the patients in this study, mechanisms by which a low-carb diet may influence renal function, elucidating the key factors important for maintaining drug-free type 2 diabetes remission, and improvements in the biomarkers of renal and cardiovascular health observed in this study. So the conclusion, given the central role of hyperglycemia in the pathogenesis of kidney disease, it seems logical to suggest that a low-carb diet approach, which by its very nature reduces your blood glucose, may be beneficial in the management of risk factors impacting kidney disease. This review suggests for people with type 2 diabetes and normal renal function or mild kidney disease that this very well may be the case. Our real-world results seem to agree, showing that in addition to type 2 diabetes drug-free remission of 48% of the participants, a low-carb diet approach was associated with a significant improvement in serum creatinine, eGFR, urine ACR, BP, blood pressure, body weight, and lipid profile. On balance, this review contradicts the notion that a low-carb diet, despite being likely higher in protein and fat, is harmful at all to your renal health. Yeah! There is, however, more uncertainty around the use of this for people with kidney disease that is moderate or severe. At least for those with normal renal function or mild kidney disease, this offers healthcare professionals using a low-carb diet intervention some reassurances that diet can improve multiple aspects of cardiometabolic health, while also posing little risk to the renal function of those with type 2 diabetes. Guys, what a study. What a study. Again, this was published in the July 2021 issue of the journal Current Opinion Endocrinology. The title of the paper, Renal Function in Patients Following a Low Carbohydrate Diet for Type 2 Diabetes, a review of the literature and an analysis of routine clinical data from a primary care service over 7 years. Thank you to Dr. David Unwin and Jen Unwin, Dominique Crocombe, Christine Delon, Nicola Guess, and Christopher Wong. They were the authors behind this awesome paper looking at low-carb diets and their impact on your kidney health. So hope you enjoyed that study. I try to bring you the cutting-edge studies right off the presses when I find them. And good news for those of us who support a low-carb ketogenic diet. Again, this is part of Jimmy Makes Science Simple. Thank you so much for watching here today. Go check us out. Jimmy Makes Science Simple is the username over on Instagram. Check it out, you guys, and we'll be back again real soon. Bye.
Get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com.
Keto Chow is a customizable shake mix that is also perfect for cooking and baking, giving you simple, nutritionally perfect meal options. Keto Chow. Make keto easy. Discover your favorite flavor at jimmylovesketochow.com.